Hello and welcome to these guidelines for training and assessment of Re-Forma's outcomes. This is to help you as a facilitator with training and assessment of your students using the Re-Forma set of outcomes. And in this short video, I want to share with you 3 keys to doing training well and 4 keys to effective assessment. But before we get into those, there's one overarching guiding principle that you should bear in mind. And that is that what we as Re-Forma are looking for is the student's demonstration of the outcomes. The student must be able to successfully demonstrate their competence in each and every one of the outcomes. That way we can be confident that the student is equipped and competent for biblical ministry in the Church of Jesus Christ. And it's based on that and your assessment of that Re-Forma issues and awards the students with our certificate, which is underwritten by the World Evangelical Alliance. And so we need to maintain the global standard based on the student's ability to demonstrate the outcomes. That is the main thing to bear in mind. So let's have a look at some keys for training firstly. The first point is that the training should be outcomes based. Of course, it is based on Re-Forma's set of outcomes, and those outcomes are biblical, simple, and practical. But of course, outcomes-based education works a little bit differently to traditional education or ministry training. Traditionally, when doing assessment or grading of one's students, the facilitator or teacher would give the students a grade or a score or a mark, a number, and perhaps a result of passed or failed. Outcomes-based education doesn't work like that. With outcomes-based education, the grade would be either competent or not yet competent. So in outcomes-based education, you are taking your students from one point to another point, and you want to help them get from where they are to where they need to be. And so as you assess the students, if they're able to demonstrate the outcome, then they are competent. If, however, they have not been able to demonstrate the outcome successfully, then you don't fail the student, you would grade them as not yet competent. And in those cases, the onus is on you as the facilitator to help your students get to the point that they are competent and able to demonstrate the outcomes. Secondly, training should be participative. Again, in traditional training classroom environments, the teacher would typically stand in the front, do most of the talking, perhaps give the students handout notes, or the students might take their own notes, and at the end of the course there would be a big final examination. And we have learned that this is not the most effective way of facilitating learning, or of doing assessment for that matter. So rather, what we encourage our facilitators to do is to make the learning environment participative, to get the students involved in discussion, talking and giving feedback and asking questions and sharing their thoughts. And you can create class and group discussions and activities whereby the students do more of the talking in the class and you as the facilitator do less of the talking. And so we have this saying, whoever talks the most learns the most. We'd encourage you to get your class to be participative. The third key for training is that it needs to be contextualized. As I said just now, the outcomes are biblical, simple, and practical. And so they're not overly theological or theoretical or overly complicated. They're simple, they're biblical, they're practical, and yet they're not easy to do, right? So because of that simplistic biblical nature of the outcomes, you are able to contextualize the outcomes and the training of the outcomes to make them applicable and relevant to your students in their context. Now, of course, there are a number of factors when it comes to contextualization that you would need to consider. Things such as the language, culture, education level, or technology available in your context. And the great thing with the outcomes is you can do the training in a different language to what the outcomes are written in. But you would have to do some work in preparing and training the students in their language. Consider their culture and the way that learning and training is typically done in your cultural context. For example, many parts of the world are oral visual preference learners. So perhaps written notes are not the most effective way of training. Perhaps you need to do more oral training. In some places, people learn through sharing stories and through drama and through music. You could employ those mediums in your training. You must think about the level of education of your students and the kinds of technology that you have and that your students have at your disposal. And so these outcomes can be taught by sitting under a tree with your students, with the Bible and the outcomes, and coming up with exercises so that your students learn to master the outcomes and so that they get to the point of being able to demonstrate the outcomes. So the training, should be outcomes-based, participative, and contextualized. Then let's move on to assessment. And we have 4 keys on doing assessment effectively. The first one is that it requires integrity. And here we're talking about the integrity of you as the facilitator. You see, at the end of the training program, you will sign an assessment sheet for each student indicating that they have successfully completed the program and demonstrated all the outcomes. And of course, there will be pressure on you to let some students get through. Students might look to take shortcuts. Students might miss some of the exercises and assessments that you give them. You need to be a person of integrity to do the right thing, because ultimately you as the facilitator are the one who will determine who ends up in the pulpit in the church of Jesus Christ. And so we place great responsibility and trust in you as the facilitator. You need to be a person of integrity. As Romans 14:12 says, so then each of us will give an account of ourselves to God. One day you will give an account to God of the way that you have stewarded the people that He has put in your care and of how you have conducted yourself in the training programs that you have run. Bear in mind also that the students learn from you as the facilitator as much through your own conduct and behavior and interaction with the students as through the actual training that you do. And so the students are looking to you to live out, to demonstrate the outcomes through your conduct with them. And so your integrity is of the utmost importance. The second key to effective assessment is inspection. Now we have this saying, you must inspect what you expect. So if you expect your students to reach a certain standard, perhaps in their Bible knowledge, in their ministry skills, or in their character formation, If you expect something of the students by the end of the program, how will you know if they have met your expectations if you don't inspect those things in them? You have to inspect what you expect. Another way of putting that is you cannot manage what you do not measure. And so assessment requires inspection of how the students are doing. And the inspection or assessment that we are looking for, as already mentioned, is the students' demonstration of their competence in the outcomes. Now, there are several methods of assessment that you can employ. And here's a variety of the methods of assessment that we would encourage you to use. Re-Forma is not married to written examinations. We believe there is a place for written exams, but that is not the only or the best way of assessing your students. There's a whole range of methods of assessment that you can use, and we would encourage you to use all of these different kinds of methods of assessment. Something that you need to be aware of when it comes to assessing the various outcomes is that the outcomes fall into 3 different categories. Now, we don't organize the outcomes this way, we don't present them this way, but they do fall into these 3 different categories or kinds. As you can see, there are heads, hands, and hearts kind of outcomes. Heads being to do with Bible knowledge, hands to do with ministry skills, and hearts to do with character formation. So when it comes to doing the assessment of a particular outcome, you need to bear in mind which of these 3 categories it falls into, and that'll guide you in finding the most suitable method of assessment. So let's think for a moment of that top category, the heads or Bible knowledge. For example, one of the outcomes that falls in that category would be summarize the 5 major teachings of Jesus. So this is to do with Bible knowledge of the teachings of Jesus. How would you assess your students on that outcome? Well, this is one where exams are effective. And if your students have a good level of reading and writing literacy skills, then you can do written examination with them. But if they are oral preference learners, you may want to use oral work for that assessment. The students can tell you the stories and the teachings of Jesus. That could even be done through voice note audio recordings sent to you from their phone. A third method of assessment that you might employ for heads kind of outcomes is that of group discussions. So you can set up group discussions in your class and then go around and listen to the students' discussion about a particular aspect of scripture, and through that you can assess their knowledge and mastery of the outcome. Right, moving on to the second category of hands or ministry skills. What would you choose to assess an outcome on that? And obviously these are practical outcomes that we're talking about. Things like preaching, teaching the Bible, evangelism, practical ministries. And so, of course, we're going to look to use practical methods of assessment, such as practical application, practical work or tasks, or group exercises. And so you can assess your students on these kinds of outcomes individually or in groups. You can also do this in the class setting. You can give the students opportunities to preach or teach or evangelize one another in role play scenarios. Or you could set up the opportunity for the students to go out together into the neighborhood, into the community, down the road, to go and evangelize in groups and to come back and report back to you how it went. You might even set up the opportunity for your students to demonstrate these ministry skills in their church by arranging it with their pastor. So you can do it in different ways, but we would encourage you to use these practical methods of assessment for the hands type of outcomes. And then the third and last category of outcomes are those to do with the hearts or the character of the person. For an example, one of the outcomes says, bear the fruit of the Spirit and practice humility, integrity, and simplicity. Now, of course, it's not going to be effective to assess your students on the fruit of the Spirit or integrity by asking them to write and tell you about those things. It's not enough for them to list the fruit of the Spirit and to describe them. That doesn't show you that the student is actually bearing the fruits of the Spirit or practicing integrity. And so you need to observe these things in your students. Observation is far and away the best method of assessment when it comes to these types of character outcomes. So we would encourage you to teach on those outcomes early in the program so that you have time through the course of your training program to observe these things in your students and to help them to become competent in these ways. One other method of assessment that you might find helpful for these sorts of outcomes is written reports. Now, that's not just writing about the fruit of the Spirit, as I said, but you could, for example, ask your students to give a written report on which of the fruit of the Spirit, which area of the fruit of the Spirit they feel God has developed the most in their life, and to share a story from their life experience which illustrates that, and conversely, which area of the fruit of the Spirit they feel is deficient in their lives, that they are lacking, and that they need God's help the most to develop in their lives, and to share a story that illustrates that from their life experience. And as the students reflect on this and think about it and write it down and share from their actual life experience, you will find that you are able to effectively assess where they are at in those things. Now, please know that you are welcome to use any method of assessment you like. We'd encourage you to use all of these ones listed here and to use a combination of methods of assessment on the outcomes. You don't need to be limited to one method of assessment or only doing one assessment per outcome. We'd encourage you to do multiple ongoing assessments for all of the outcomes. So rather than doing a summative assessment at the end, do continual assessment as you go. That takes us to the third key on assessment, which is intervention. So as you find a student is struggling to demonstrate the outcome, that they are not yet competent in a particular outcome, what you as the facilitator needs to do is to intervene, to step in and to help the student. And so this is about helping the students to develop their competence. Now, you need to bear in mind that as you assess your students and as you give them feedback and intervene, that naturally, as people, the students are not going to like being assessed or being critiqued and giving that feedback in areas where they are struggling. Nobody likes that sort of assessment. And so you need to know that you're dealing with people. And as such, you need to deal with them with compassion, but at the same time with the truth. We don't skirt around or shy away from the truth. If you need to give them some hard, honest feedback, you need to do that, but you do it with compassion and to be fair and firm with the students. And so we would like to share with you this idea of how to give the feedback to your students, and that is what we call, in a way that we call, the sandwich method. The sandwich method of giving feedback. Now, if you've ever eaten a sandwich, you'll know that there are two slices of bread with some fillings or contents in the sandwich, giving it these three levels. And so if you think of the top level of the sandwich, the top level of the sandwich method that you start with in giving feedback is to tell the student what they have done well. Give them the positive feedback first. Secondly, moving on to the second layer, you tell the students where there is room for improvement. And so this is now giving them feedback on where they are struggling, but you don't tell them this is what you've done poorly. You tell them this is where there is room for improvement. And then the third and final layer of the sandwich is giving the student recommendations of how they can improve and become competent in that outcome. And approaching your feedback this way will help you as the facilitator feel more at ease and comfortable in having to give sometimes some difficult feedback, and it will make your students feel more at ease and receive the feedback more easily, and hopefully feel encouraged and motivated to go and take your recommendations to heart and to work on those outcomes. And then you would give the students another opportunity to be assessed again in that outcome, so that they can go from being not yet competent to being competent. And then the fourth and final key on assessment is integration. And so you need to integrate your training and assessment together in your program. As I've mentioned, we do not believe in summative assessment at the end of a training program. It would be very difficult for the students to have a big final exam and have to remember everything that they have learned through the whole program and write a big exam with a lot of pressure at the end. It's far more effective to assess the students as you work through the training material and through the outcomes. And so we rather encourage our facilitators to do continual training and assessment. And that means you need to work out a program and schedule for your training, and where you will include assessments along the way. Which methods of assessment are going to be suitable for the various outcomes, and how you'll work those in together. And as you do that, you will find that by making your classes more participative and practical, that you can actually be doing assessment at the same time that you are doing training. And this is a very effective way of doing the assessment. One last thought I'd like to share with you is to pay attention to the wording of the outcomes. The outcomes are carefully worded, and they will guide you in what exactly is required of the students, what exactly it is that they are supposed to be able to demonstrate. So please do pay attention to the wording of the outcomes. So I hope that is helpful to you, these keys on doing training and assessment of Re-Forma's outcomes effectively. And bear in mind the overarching guiding principle. What we are looking for is the students' successful demonstration of their competence in the outcomes. And I trust that as you follow these keys for training and assessment, that you will see great success in your training program, and that the students will truly be well equipped and competent for biblical ministry in the Church of Jesus Christ. Thank you for your attention, and may God bless you in your training program. Bye-bye.